This is another folk tale, and the reason why I chose this story, it's a brand new story to me, but this project has teenagers and older citizens, older senior citizens in it, and Carol asked me to come up with a story that might involve both. And I thought, well, you know, I may not be able to do that, but I did find this story. It's called Meat Loves Salt. And I think it was a prototype of the King Lear story, Shakespeare's King Lear. This is about an old king. He's quite old, and he's got 3 grown-up daughters. And he loves these daughters very much, and he calls them to him one at a time one day. And he said, I'm going into town. What would you like me to bring you? He said this to the oldest daughter, and she said, I want a bright, flashing red dress. And he said, all right. And then he called the second daughter and said, what would you like if I go to town? And she said, I want a dark, flashing green dress. He said, all right. And then he asked the youngest daughter, and she said, oh, Father, please bring me a beautiful, solid white dress. And so he went off to town on his horse, and he did buy the 3 dresses, and he folded them carefully and put them in the bottom of his saddlebag. And then as he was coming down a hill and into the place where his castle was, there was a maple tree with a low-hanging branch, and he thought he'd knock his head against it. And so he broke off the branch, and twined around it were white roses, beautiful white vine of white roses. And so he put them on his saddle, and he continued on his way. And then, one by one, he called the daughters to him, and he presented that bright, flashing red dress. And he had broken off one of the white roses and put it on top. And he said, how much do you love me? And she said, oh, I love you as much or more than all the jewels and gold in the whole world. Well, he liked that answer, and he presented her with the dress, and she went off to prepare for a dance. And then he called the middle daughter. He said, how much do you love me? And she said, oh, I love you more than all the boyfriends and sweethearts I could ever have. For that's what she was thinking of. And he liked that answer. And so he presented her with her dark, flashing green dress, and he had broken a white rose off and put it on top of the dress and handed it to her, and she went off to prepare for a dance. Now the youngest daughter was his favorite, and he loved her best of all, and he couldn't wait to hear what she had to say. And so he said, how much do you love me? And she said, I can't answer a question like that. And he said, well, I must know how much do you love me? And she said, I just love you. I love you like meat loves salt. And he said, what? And she said, yes, I love you like meat loves salt. And he was furious. He threw down the white dress, and he grabbed a hold of his daughter. It was the wrong answer, and he was furious. He took her up to the highest tower in his castle and locked her in. There was only one window. And the only person she saw for many, many years was an old woman who brought her bread and water. Other than that, she was a prisoner in this tower. And one day, she was sitting by the one window, brushing her long hair and letting her tears flow freely. When down below and out in the countryside, a young man heard her. He heard her crying. He was the Duke of England, and he was riding on his horse, and he followed the sound of her tears. And then he looked up and saw her in the window of the tower, and he knew he had to talk to her. So he climbed up a grapevine slowly and carefully and got all the way to the top of the tower and the window. And they just looked at each other, and they knew. And he helped her down and put her on the back of his horse, and they went off to his kingdom in England and were married and had a family and were quite happy. Now, in the meantime, the 2 older daughters, the oldest daughter and the middle daughter, well, they married, and they went and lived with began living with their husbands, and they were all royal blood, and they lived in castles and were quite fine. And gradually, the old king got very old, and he couldn't take care of himself anymore. And so he went to live with the oldest daughter and her husband. And right away, immediately, she took all of the precious things that he had brought from his own castle to surround himself with, and she sold them for her own pleasure. And so he knew that she didn't love him. And then he went to stay with his second daughter, the middle daughter. And her husband did not like the old king at all. And the middle daughter, she was embarrassed by the old king, and she made him eat with the servants and sleep in the kitchen. And so he wandered off. And nobody ever even thought to look and see where he was. He just disappeared. Now, after that, not long after that, those two big kings, the one that was married to the oldest daughter and the one that was married to the middle daughter, they decided to wage war on the Duke of England. And so the Duke of England and his wife, the youngest daughter, and his troops and his ships and all of his retinue came over to fight the battle with those two kings. And when the youngest daughter got to her home country again, she said, "Oh, husband, you know how much I love you and how happy we've been. But now that I'm at my own country again, I want to go see where I used to live. And I'll go see it, and then I'll come back to you." And she rode off. But when she got to the castle of the old king, it was a charred ruin. The buildings had all fallen down or were burned. And there was a heavy smell of smoke in the air. And as she stared around, she saw the old king. He was in rags. And he had made a crown out of a briar bush with almost like thorns in it. He put it on top of his head, and he was talking to himself. And when she saw him, even though he had imprisoned her all those years, all of that fell away. And she remembered how much she loved him. And she went to him, and he didn't recognize her. But she took him back to the Duke of England and their encampment, and he agreed to stay. And after the war was won, the Duke of England won the war and took all of his family and his ships and his retinue and the old king back to his own castle in England. And there, the youngest daughter made up a beautiful apartment for him, and she gave him anything he could want, and she kept him as comfortable as possible, even though he still didn't know who she was. And one night she got an idea. And she went to the cook, and she said, "Now, tonight when you cook the meat, I don't want you to add any salt, not one grain of salt." And the cook said, "Well, I don't want to do that. It won't taste right." And she said, "You listen to me and do what I tell you." So the cook made the meat without any salt. And it was put before the old king. And he ate. He took a couple of bites of the meat. And then he put it down, and he put his head in his hands, and he started to cry. And he said, "I had a daughter. And she told me she loved me like meat loves salt. And I was angry. I was mad at her, and I treated her badly. I didn't try to understand. And now I don't know what's become of her." And the youngest daughter just said, "Father," and all at once, the king's memory returned. And he recognized his youngest daughter. Oh, and he went over and he gave her a big hug. And his sorrow turned to joy. And he sent a servant back to the charred ruins of the castle to look for the white dress. And sure enough, the servant found the white dress folded as it was all those years ago. And he brought it back, and there was a spray of roses on the top, white roses, that looked as though they'd just been picked. And that's the story.